Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn Knight with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and this week we're looking at a really distinctive raptor that can be found throughout North American waterways. Now, the osprey is the lone species of the Pandionidae family, which basically means that out of the entire order, which makes up hawks and eagles. It's a raptor. It's definitely a raptor. It shares a bunch of features with these birds, but it also has a number of noteworthy adaptations which sets it apart from the rest. And we're going to be exploring a little bit about those so that you're familiar with them. Now, it is worth noting that when you're dealing with one species that is found worldwide on every continent except Antarctica, there's going to be distinctions between each local species, right? You can't have a species that's present in Maine and also Brazil and Australia and Mongolia that doesn't experience some amount of genetic drift. To that end, there's a little bit of a debate currently within different taxonomic systems as to whether or not to split off the Australian subspecies as its own. But the majority of taxonomic systems of ordering these birds and organizing them does hold that it is just one single osprey species. So you get your ID down here in California with the osprey, and you'll be good no matter where you're going in the world. So we're going to be taking a look at these birds. We're going to be giving you what you need to identify them in the fields. We're going to be teaching you a little bit about their life history so you know what sort of habitats to find them in, so you know what requirements they have in order to survive in an area. And throughout that, we're going to be also delving into those adaptations which set them apart from the rest of our hawks and our eagles. So, taking a look at these birds. Right off the bat, they're pretty dang distinctive. We're going to be starting off with the colors of these birds, just because that's one of the first things that obviously catches your eye about them. They're very distinctive, dark brown that can almost look black from a distance or with the light hitting it in a certain way, and they are bright, bright white on the stomach. And in fact, that's a really good mark for them to be aware of. With many of our hawks, they have paler undersides, but there are patterns present going across the breast, across the belly, and on the underside of the wings. But the osprey is almost a completely clean white on that stomach, which is fairly distinctive. Now, with a lot of birds, especially ones that you're going to be seeing flying up in the sky or over the water, it helps more to not pay attention to the specific colors of those birds because those can change if the lighting is unfavorable, if you're relying on something like an iridescent patch for your ID. That's why we don't rely on just one field mark for identifying a species. But the reason you pay attention to the dark and the light is that even if the sun is right above you, it's shining kind of into your eyes, even if light is reflecting off of the water and hitting the bird in an unfavorable manner, those patterns are still going to be present. The osprey makes it easy in that it is wholly dark brown or white. There's no subtle variations that we're looking for in order to ID these birds. They're just effectively black and white in the field, which is really nice. And it does give us the bird that looks like this, that is absolutely striking. I mean, it's hard to see that and not be impressed. So, when we're looking at field marks for these birds, right off the bat, on the head, we've got those eye stripes, and they go from the beak itself, the nares and the nostrils, all the way back to the head, to the back of the head, going through the eye, with a white cap and a white throat. So you've got a very distinctive division of its face, which is really nice. Many of our hawks will have dark caps or an entirely dark head, So that really distinctive striping is a really good field mark to keep a hold of. But sometimes you don't get to see the head very well. They're moving too fast. It's a relatively small body part, so we're not going to always rely on that, right? We need some other things to help us out. It's worth noting, these are sizable birds. Your average osprey has a wingspan of about 5.5 feet, give or take a handful of inches, based on the individual. So there's nothing really small about these guys. If they're in the area and you've got eyes on them, you're going to notice their size. Another thing that's worth noting is they're pretty rangy birds. They've got long legs. They will extend them if they're doing any amount of hunting, because remember, raptors are going to be striking with their feet first while capturing their prey. So they're going to be stretching those legs out for you to see. Another thing that's worth noting about these birds, and which does set them apart from the rest of our hawks and our eagles, is the shape of their wings. Now this is really evident in this particular shot because of the position of the wings themselves. If it's just straight flying through the air, it's not going to be nearly this dramatic, but their wings are kind of gull-shaped. They've got a more narrow aspect ratio on their wings than your typical hawk and eagle have. Now, hawks and eagles have really broad wings. It helps them soar, so they can circle in the air without flapping their wings. Osprey is not about that life. They've got a more narrow wing, which is helpful because, one, they're going to be diving. They're not going to be just circling around. They're diving and chasing after their prey. But their prey is in the water. These guys are pescatarians. About 80%, if not more, of their diet is comprised of fish. So there is a lot of activity that happens in and around the water with these guys. Many of you guys have probably seen the videos of bald eagles trying to swim through the water after they've gone after a fish, and it does not work well for them. Their wings are just too broad to really give them the lift to break free of the water. Osprey does not have that problem. On top of that, the osprey actually has waterproof wings. They've got oily feathers, which sheds water. They're pretty much the only raptor that's got that adaptation. They're really, really well designed for being in the water, but if you pay attention to those feet, you're going to notice they're not webbed. They don't actually want to swim in the water. They just want to be able to get in and out with as little effort as possible. Going back to the field marks and the wings in particular, you'll notice at the bend of these wings, essentially where the wrist is on this bird's arms, is dark. Now, there are dark patches on the wings of pretty much all of our raptors, but the location of them is a really important field mark to pay attention to. A really reliable mark for, say for example, our red-tailed hawk, is that the patagium, so the skin that stretches basically from the shoulder to the wrist or so on the bird, is dark. For the osprey, it's pretty much just that wrist patch, which does help you out because you have otherwise pale wings, and just that small patch just as the wing bends is going to be dark, which is significantly easier to spot when the bird is soaring above you than trying to get eyes on the side of its head to see the eye stripe. So, and of course, you know, you can't really go into the field with these birds, or any bird, without trying to put some effort into learning the call, which is kind of piercing. I'd just like to put to bed the idea that raptors all have this really dramatic and majestic call. In most media depictions of predatory birds, you'll have like a bald eagle, and it's soaring past the camera, and it lets out this great scream that you're just like, that inspires terror in whatever it's hunting. That's a red-tailed hawk. Red-tailed hawks have a really dramatic call. The rest of the raptors are squeaky. They chirp at each other. And the osprey is no exception. So if you get the call in your ear, you can keep an ear out when you're on, your lakes, your local reservoirs, while you're searching out this bird, because when you're by water, sound carries. So you really do want to keep an ear out for that call. Now, all of that's really good for IDing the bird once you've found it, right? But you do actually have to find where the osprey is, right? Now, I'm never not going to recommend eBird. Obviously, you can find out where your local ospreys are hanging out before you go out, and that's a really good strategy. But it is also worth it to pay attention to the actual habitat itself and try and figure out, well, does this provide what the osprey needs? So we'll start off with food, because that's the easiest, right? They're mostly eating fish. So you need a body of water with lots of fish. It's worth noting that the osprey, when it dives, doesn't really go for depths past 3 feet. They're not going to be swimming into the depths of the water after these fish itself. They're mostly just going to dive in, grab it, and then try and get out of the water as quickly as possible, because even with waterproof feathers, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time. And as they hit the water, it's really, really distinctive. We can actually see the dive process itself here. They kind of just fold themselves up and hit feet first to go after those fish. But once we've done that, our other requirement for survival is water. If there are fish, there's also going to be water. And then you've got shelter. And can they build a nest? They like trees, but the nice thing about osprey is they will actually use man-made platforms. And what feeds into this is there's actually a ton of different nest cams online that have been set up on osprey nests. So if you take the time, Google osprey nest cams, and you'll get a couple of different options for watching them. The babies are adorable. And you can see both of the parents bringing in fish in these gigantic stick nests. They just pile in all of the sticks and then they'll lay their eggs in the middle of it. So it's a lot of work to build it, but it is large enough to allow them to raise multiple babies. And what's actually interesting about these guys is, unlike many of our birds, the osprey eggs do not all hatch at the same time. They'll have their first laid egg hatch, and then a couple of days later, the rest of the eggs will begin to hatch. And what that does is it allows them a safety net in terms of reproductive success. These birds are predators. They live in a reality in which food is not guaranteed. They have to actively hunt, and they're good hunters. When they're fishing, they've got a success rate of about 1 out of 4, which is pretty dang good in terms of our natural predators. But it does mean they're putting out a lot of energy for, maybe they don't catch anything that day. And so if food is scarce, that means they have at least one chick that has an advantage and may survive through the season to fledge and go on to reproduce on its own in later years. It's easier to do that if you've got one that's already a couple of days older. It's got that advantage of being fed on its own without having to compete with any of its siblings. Once again, nature's not always nice, but what can you do? Now, talking about the adaptations of these birds, the feet are really something that stands out on these birds. We've spoken about these birds are raptors, so they're going to have raptor-like features. They've got a hooked bill, they've got strong, sharp talons. And you can see that even in this picture of this bird in the air. You can see those talons. The cool thing about these talons is one of the outer toes can actually flip around. So the standard setup for a hawk's foot is you've got 3 toes in the front and then 1 in the back that allows them to close their grasp, right? Osprey can do that, and then they can also flip one of those outer toes back so that they can have a two-toe in front, two-toe in back grip. This is important when you're dealing with something like fish, which are slippery and a pain. And the osprey actually carry the fish in a specific way. You'll notice that the head of the fish always faces in the same direction as the head of the osprey, and they do that because it cuts down wind resistance. But it's that unique foot configuration that allows them to actually kind of handle the fish in such a manner. All the rest of the birds that are interacting with fish are kind of just like, I guess I'm carrying this like it's a terrible slippery purse. It's not at all efficient. Now, beyond that, the scales of these toes actually have barbs on them. Now, many of our birds have scales on their feet. It's for protection. It's also, evidence that they're dinosaurs, so that's always fun. But the osprey takes it one step further, and it's not just for protecting their toes and their feet, but it also helps them keep a grip on what are, once again, super, super slippery food products. Beyond this, I really do want to highlight a difference in body shape for these birds. So these are two birds that rely heavily on fish for their food. The top is our osprey. The bottom is the Steller's sea eagle. Now, just looking at these two birds, and obviously it's a slightly different pose, but the very first thing you note is how much the osprey folds in on itself. The wings come in, the feet come forward, so that's going to be what hits the water first. Whereas the Steller's sea eagle, you can see that there's a clear intent to not touch the water if at all possible. The osprey is ready to dive in. The Steller's sea eagle does not want to touch the water as much as possible, and the reasons for that are myriad. One, the Steller's sea eagle is a very northern species, so you don't want that water on you. It's going to be very cold. And another thing is the osprey is waterproof. It can shake off that water very, very easily. On top of that, osprey can actually close their nostrils, or their nares. We're talking about birds, their nares, which is just super cool. They can seal that off so that when they hit the water, they're not getting a lung full of water. On top of that, if you get a picture of an osprey, you may notice that its eyes look kind of a milky white. That's nothing wrong with the bird. It's not blind or anything like that. That's something called the nictitating membrane. It's the third eyelid that flips up in order to protect the eye. Most animals have one to a greater or lesser degree. Humans have a vestigial one. It's the little bit of pink right by your nose and the inside of your eye. But the osprey are a really good example of them putting it to use in order to survive. So, with that, I am going to point out that these birds, because they're relying on fish and our water sources, they are vulnerable to the use of toxins by humans. These guys were almost wiped out, along with many of our other birds, with the use of DDT in the mid 20th century. With its ban in the 70s, we have seen a resurgence of these birds, and they're actually doing really, really well. But your PSA for the day is that the use of things like pesticides, rodenticides, all of these toxins that we use in agriculture and just keeping pests away from us, those don't leave the systems. They don't just disappear once we've used them. They get into our waterways, they get into the food webs around us, and oftentimes their effects are ones that we do not anticipate but are often deleterious. So, with that cheerful note, good luck on finding your local osprey. I encourage you guys to find a water system with them and just do some exploring, hopefully away from people. Have a great day, and I'll see y'all next week.